to introduce the folks speaking this evening. I'm also part of the group WorldAfterFukushima311 Vimeo, and it's a group of us who came together from Japan, the US, and around the world to think about how to respond to what happened on March 11th. And personally, I've been involved most recently in the events around Occupy Wall Street and this kind of global uprising that we're seeing, and people responding to a crisis and coming together in horizontal ways and creating assemblies. And something that I think is going to be really important over the next few days is now that we have this wonderful opportunity to have folks with us from Japan to talk about the crisis and how these are all linked crises around the world and how our responses, though different, are also really similar and connected. So I look forward to a few days of conversations for us to think about both kind of crisis and alternative and where they meet and don't, perhaps. So tonight's panel, and I'm going to introduce it in the order in which people will be speaking. So I think people are speaking from your left to right. First is Joel Covell, and I will say it, Joel was my professor more than 20 years ago in college. And he's going to be speaking on nuclear power, capitalism's dream, humanity's nightmare. He's the co-editor of the Journal on Capitalism, Nature, and Socialism, and is the author of many books, including most recently The Enemy of Nature, which was translated into Japanese. Second, we have Yoshihiko Ikigami, who's going to speak about the background of the rising movement of people against nuclear power, after 311 especially. I mean, he's the former editor of Inuso, and an independent writer. I do apologize ahead of time for my pronunciation. Then we have Chigaya Kinoshita, who's a political and economic, who's going to speak on the political and economic analysis before and after March 11th, and he's a political scientist and an activist from Tokyo. Then we have Adrian Hurley, who is who's sharing the eco-anarchist views after March 11th in reference to Franklin Lopez's End of Civilization. She is an activist and a professor of Japanese literature at McGill in Canada. Then we have Ayumi Goto, who's going to speak about the analysis of everyday life in Japan after March 11th, and she's a historian and an activist in particular with day laborers in Osaka. And then we'll close with Silvia Federici, who is a teacher, writer, feminist, and also a part of the group Todos Somos, and she's going to give a theoretical analysis of the reproduction of women's struggle under radiation. Before we start, if Sabo and Yuko, who are going to be translating, but might say just a little bit about what J. Fissures is and Todos Somos Japón, and perhaps introduce the book, because you'll be translating too, so people will see you and who we are.
Mm-hmm. My name is Yuko, and Sabu right there, and I started a website called jfishers.org, and that was 2 weeks after March 11th. We got together and decided that we had to do something. We knew the information was going to be covered up, and so we asked our friends and comrades in Japan and overseas to write, and we would translate and make it into a collection of a series of writings since around what's happening in Japan after March 11th. And then we formed a group called Todos Somos Japón to make a connection between struggles and activism in Japan and the rest of the world, to not to cut the tie between sorry. So thank you for coming.
Thank you. Good evening, and great pleasure to be here. I will allow my comrades on the panel to fill in a great deal of detail. I would like to begin the presentations with a rather general overview in which the Fukushima events are certainly part. I don't know if any of you have read the October 13th issue of the New Yorker, in which there was a lengthy article on the Fukushima events, and I couldn't find it when I was drafting this today. I think it's by a guy named Greg Osnos or something like that. And in any event, it's a perfect New Yorker article. It's very, very well written. The New Yorker has the sort of the laurels for what is considered elegant and fair-minded journalism. It's graceful in spots, even it's compassionate. But then if you look closely at it, the moral it gives us is a rather familiar one, which those of us who have been working these fields are all too familiar for many years. You might say it's on the one hand and on the other hand view of reality. And on the one hand, things are bad, but on the other hand, things are not too bad. And therefore, there's really no need for fundamental change. And indeed, it says very explicitly that the evidence of these events following March 11th is such to give no comfort to those who wish for Japan to abandon the nuclear path. It also makes a very interesting account of just how deeply embedded the nuclear path is in the class structure of Japan and so on and so forth. But it really leaves you with this typical liberal gesture of shrugging your shoulders and say, well, we have to be fair-minded and just sort of let things be. However, an example of the integrity of an article of this sort occurs midway when the author is comparing it with other nuclear catastrophes, nuclear energy catastrophes, and comes to the greatest one before the Fukushima events, and that is to say the one on Chernobyl, and says, well, Chernobyl was bad, but it also wasn't too bad. And they say, well, it even killed 5,000 people. And then it goes on, and then the next thing you see is that, well, wait a second, they left out something, didn't they? And this is amazing. This is supposed to be responsible journalism, who doesn't take into account that in the year 2009, there was a report on Chernobyl by three very, very eminent students in Russia, Alexei Yavlovkov and Vasily Nesterenko and Alexei Nesterenko. This is the Russian Academy of Sciences and so forth. This was actually published under the aegis of the New York Academy of Science, which is highly respectable body. Blackwell puts out a book along these lines. The New Yorker doesn't mention it, and therefore it doesn't mention the fact that their conclusion is not that 5,000 people perished from the events at Chernobyl, but 1 million people perished from the events at Chernobyl. Now, of course, you can't count it, but you can do sophisticated readings of this. And when you see what a stupendous error that is, not a simple mistake, obviously, but a systematic tendentious error, you realize what you're up against. And you realize also that the New Yorker was the magazine that actually published John Hersey's Hiroshima and let the world know about those events in 1945 or 46, I guess it was. And you can say much more about it. It's not really pertinent, except that you can follow the decline and fall of this journal and also see it is coordinated with the fact that it is, in effect, it's the instrument of the official spokesperson of the fashion industry of the United States. It strictly serves the interests of that sector of capital. And so all of the rather interesting details of the story are buried under the bland cover of, well, so what, nothing can be done. But that bland cover is put over it by the class interest of the journal. I refuse to think of the New Yorker as just independent journalists, as none are really in this respect. And so by extension, you can say that the entire ideological apparatus, insofar as it is controlled by the capitalist system, and that would include the rest of the media and, of course, academia, and, of course, a lot of the scientific establishment, are also subject to the same powers, and that we need what Marx called ruthless criticism of everything existing if we are to peel away that. And I hope the rest of the panel, I'm sure the rest of the panel will do that for us. I just want to make some observations along these lines. Nuclear power, as you know, wasn't the original idea. The original idea was nuclear weapons, and then somebody had the bright idea that we could convert that strange energy into power of really infinite magnitude, and that it would become, in the words of the original ideologues, too cheap to meter. It would be basically free energy. Well, of course, if it was free energy, the capitalist system would have had no use for it, and that never turned out to be the case. In fact, there was much more than that. What started as the so-called free energy has turned into this behemoth, 400 plants around the world of extraordinary complexity, ponderousness, all kinds of problems which our panel, I'm sure, will touch upon later, and I'm not going to take up the time because we have so many good people here to speak, and I don't want to take too much of the time. But it's important to realize that even if the nuclear power industry is not especially profitable, in fact, it's racked with economic problems, it persists and is so deeply embedded in the ideological infrastructure of our world as to be given more or less a free ride in almost every instance of economic or political engagement. And I think we have to recognize that nuclear power is something that it is indeed something like a dream for capitalism, because if you follow the evolution of capital, you'll see that, and this is something drawn directly out of Marx, Marx's Capital, that it always tends towards massive concentration. It always tends towards great, ponderous, bureaucratic, highly technological forms. It always does so in such a way as to disempower people and to mystify them. And in the case of nuclear power, there's nuclear energy, and in all of its forms, there are two additional components which make it capitalist dream. One is that it's very suitable for something that I wrote about in a book 25 years ago called Against the State of Nuclear Terror, that it's suitable for a deep and sort of subtle kind of terrorization because nobody can comprehend it. And the reason nobody can comprehend it, meaning nuclear power, is that life on Earth only began to evolve after the Earth stopped being radioactive, which took about 1 billion years, and then life began. And so life, and all of us, are in a way disengaged from it, and it's an other. It's nothing we can feel, nothing we can see. It can be measured, of course, by our instruments. It has tremendous effects on living systems, but not in any such a way that could be ecologically described, for example. And that makes it suitable to be inserted into ideological processes as a kind of a godlike other that we have to kind of bow down before and can be manipulated in many ways by the state apparatus. And the other thing, and the most important thing so far as capital is concerned, is that it does have this mystique of unlimited energy, that it can go on and on. It's incredible. My goodness, there's no end to it. Well, that's not true. There is an end to it, and it comes about in the context of the reckoning that we now face when nuclear energy is now once again being drawn into the center of things. I may add, of course, the reason it survived at all is because of its embeddedness in the state, so that the state, this is in the US and I believe elsewhere, guarantees it. It can't fail. You know, there are these laws in place that make the that ensure almost any nuclear accident from happening, and that's paid for by public money. So capital integrates itself with the worst aspects of the state. Now, what we're seeing in Fukushima is actually a very malignant tendency in which something called the ecological crisis intersects with the nuclear power, which is, of course, part of the ecological crisis. The ecological crisis has to do with the continual expansion of capital and of its creation of ecological destabilization at every point of our planet. And this constitutes I think, the leading contradiction, the leading crisis in the world today. And ecological crises, which may or may not relate to increased seismic activity, because seismic activity has increased by a factor of 5 over the last 20 years. I don't understand why that is so, but it has. And indeed, there was an earthquake in Berkeley, California just yesterday, and there was a big earthquake, well, big by our standards, in Virginia that hadn't happened for hundreds of years. So what happened in Japan is, of course, the most horrendous instance, but it's by no means the only such instance. Now, what's going on is that nuclear power, which seemed to be in a state of disarray and indeed collapse, because it really is so economically inefficient, et cetera, has been propounded, as I'm sure many of you know, as the answer to the gathering crisis of climate change, which itself is going to wreck nuclear power plants, because climate change will lead to melting of ice caps, rising of sea levels. A lot of nuclear plants are by the water. The horrors of Fukushima resulted from, of course, partially from a tsunami, and you might think of the ecological crisis as a slow-motion tsunami that will greatly increase the unreliability of nuclear power plants. Now, we now have the prospect of leading ideologues, including the best climate scientist in the world, in my view, James Hansen, and a top-notch journalist, George Monbiot, both saying that the only way that we can survive global warming is by reviving nuclear power. And this kind of argument obviously reinforces the capitalists in here, this country, in France, which, by the way, all the French nuclear reactors are not seismically intact. They're all threatened, France being the most highly nuclearized power. And needless to say, of course, in Japan, and our fellow panelists will cover that, will take on this role. They take on this role even as the dangers of nuclear power have never been greater, except they will keep getting worse and worse. It is amazing that people of the intelligence of Hansen or even Monbiot would come up with such a harebrained idea as replacing fossil fuels to lower the carbon input into the atmosphere with nuclear power. Elementary calculations will tell us that if you were to do this, even at the present rate of demand, there will be, instead of 400 nuclear power plants around the world, there will have to be 4,000 nuclear power. No, sorry, I had that wrong. There'll be 8,000 nuclear power plants around the world. And as Stan Cox has recently calculated, if we take the projected increase in demand for electricity and power of all sorts over the next few generations, by the year 2050, at that time, there have to be, 18,500 nuclear power plants, where we now have 400. Can you imagine such an event? Well, we won't have that, because as a matter of fact, we're going to run out of uranium even before that. So, however you look at it, this is a hopeless, I'm winding up, profoundly irrational turn of events. And in a way, it's liberating, because it should free us from any attachment to this kind of thinking and free us towards what can only be the only condition for survival. I mean, in truth, to try to choose between nuclear power and hydrocarbon power is like choosing between committing suicide by hanging or poison. I mean, the only path out of that, of course, is to change the structure of society itself. And the only way to do that is by detaching ourselves from the capitalist system as such, because it is true that although we can survive on renewable energies, and I think if we're going to survive, we will survive on renewable energies, because we will not survive on either nuclear energy or hydrocarbon energy. The only way to do that is through a new form of society itself. It's an objectively revolutionary state of affairs. And needless to say, this leads us into a much larger discussion. I call this in my own work eco-socialism. There's much, much more that can be said about it. I'm clearly not here to say that, but I am here to open the door upon that, because the only real way, I think, to overcome the curse of nuclear power is to combine it with an anti-capitalist movement and to move to the next phase of human society. Thank you.
Good evening, all. My name is Yoshihiko Ikegami, coming from Tokyo near Fukushima. Firstly, I must thank to all the members of Todos Somos Happen for inviting us here in New York, and the Japan officials, Sab and Yuko. And I stay here in New York, in Brooklyn. I enter some restaurant or shops, and they always ask me where I'm from. I answer, I'm from Japan. They all say, oh, Fukushima. Thank you for all the New Yorkers keep Fukushima in mind. Okay. Let's begin. In the afternoon of March the 11th, a mega earthquake occurred in the Pacific Ocean near Japan, and the gigantic tsunami followed, attacking the northeastern coast of Japan. We saw on television many people swallowed. We heard that the tsunami also caused a serious accident of the nuclear power plants in Fukushima. The next day, on the 12th, the first nuclear plant exploded. And on the 14th, the second power plant, and soon after, the third exploded. The reactors began to melt down. Many of us felt that this is the end of the world. We felt fear, regret, humiliation, despair, and anger. These feelings and emotions have been the basis of our way of thinking, and did until today. In the process of the explosions, incredible amount of radioactive materials were released in the air, flying with the wind and spreading not only over Fukushima, but a vast area of the eastern Japan. In consequence, air was polluted. Vegetables and the water were all contaminated by radioactivity. We have lost our old food. Thus, we were thrown out into the middle of the radioactivity. But at the moment, none of us really knew what is radioactivity and what would happen if we were contaminated by it. No one could explain it explicitly. We were all confused. Our government immediately let the residents who lived within 20 kilometers from the damaged plant escape. But the government and the mass media announced over and over again that in this situation was not an emergency. There was no need to worry about and no need to escape. Further, they underlined that the food were almost safe. If we ate them, nothing would happen to our health. They mobilized a number of specialists of nuclear physics to stress the normality of the situation by using technical terms. Few of us could understand what they were saying, but our bodies told us the danger. From that moment of contamination, we had to convince ourselves that we should tackle with what's really going on. My speech today is a story of how we fathomed out the situation and how we deal with it. Nuclear disaster is a strange calamity compared with tsunami, which caused about 20,000 deaths. The nuclear disaster has caused no deaths until now, publicly. In this sense, this disaster is still in the beginning. In case of Chernobyl, first patients of cancer, most of them were children, appeared after 5 or 10 years, and the peak of bladder cancer came 20 years after. Cancer, leukemia, malfunction of our body do not mean immediate death. We live in a permanent fear as to when we become ill, when our loved ones catch disease for a long time to come. In Japan today, they say that developing nuclear illness is a matter of probability. In fact, the number of those who do not get ill amounts more than those who do. This fact makes the matters far more complicated. Those who do not fear nuclear or try not to fear are many, but our beloved ones are all one and only. This fear lies in the base of our feeling and activity. Right after the accident, the government evacuated the residents around nuclear power plant and did nothing more. Radioactivity is carried by the wind, but the government intentionally neglected to announce weather information for fear of panic. The people who were ignorant of weather conditions had to escape along with radioactive route. They were not just a few. They were heavily exposed to radiation because of the false or non-information. From March 11th to the end of the month was quite an important moment, for in this period, people began to learn. They mastered the structure of reactor to understand what was going on, learn the nature of all kinds of nuclear substances and their effects upon us, cesium, iodine, strontium, plutonium, etc. And until a unit of radioactive dose, Becquerel, Siebel. On top of what we had to understand what the government and its proxy scholars were really saying, it was the most essential matter for us to judge by ourselves, to distinguish true information from false one. To misjudge means death for us. One day, we engaged a nuclear specialist and held a workshop of radiation. We thought that about 50 people would show up. But in reality, more than 300 people came. His speech felt a touch too specific. And yet, a mother holding her baby in her arms asked a very detailed question concerning the difference among alpha ray, beta ray, and gamma ray. The level of her knowledge was that of a university classroom of physics. Of course, in Japan, there have been anti-nuclear movements for about 40 years. Although they could not stop the working reactors, there have been some cases where they succeeded in stopping construction of new ones. Confronting the present accident, some scholars and engineers sent us a useful message and truthful information, but the accidents through the internet, radio, and weekly magazines, everybody refers the words of theirs. Within a few weeks, many of us learned and mastered this kind of information and gradually became aware that both the government and the electric company were lying. We did this, learning as an individual or a group. Oppressive feelings hung over during the first months. The electric company said that the accident of nuclear power plant had brought lack of electric power, so the electric supply was limited. Tokyo was dark and gloom. On April 11th, a demonstration broke this gloomy feeling. That demonstration was motivated neither by the established organization nor the anti-nuclear groups, but by the young people who were forced to be flexible workers or non-regular employees. About 150,000 people gathered. It was the class of people who could keep up with the impetus of mass movement after March 11th. I think this is very important to remember. Luckily, here is the person who has begun this movement, the important person, Mr. Matsumoto. Matsumoto-kun wa? He's going to the laboratory, restroom.
He's in the restroom, yeah.
Sorry. Let's continue. From that moment, the people began to raise their cry. That was that was the anger against the government that continued to tell lies and against the electric company that caused the accident. That was also the will to share their fear in common. That was also the great regret against themselves for that the nuclear power introduced in their lives. That was a common feeling towards the future, but we have also learned enough that there were a lot of things to be done before us. As you know well, radioactive matters cannot be seen, smelled, and sensed. We cannot perceive it. There is only one method to detect it, that is to use Geiger counter or decimeter to measure the dose of radiation. We have begun to use it. To buy Geiger counter is not easy and it is not cheap, but the people managed to get it and began to measure everything. They measure nearby parks and schoolyards where their children play. We can find radioactive matters everywhere. We can find radioactive materials scattered in a mosaic way. This movement of measuring immediately grew wider and wider among us. In case of Chernobyl, personal use of decimeter was banned. To measure dose of radioactive and judge action to take for themselves was that government fears the most. Now in Japan, the central and local government often criticize the people for measuring themselves. They say that an amateur is not reliable. For them, reliability belongs only to the officials and the specialists. They want to mean it is all safe. With that, not only learn the scientific knowledge on nuclear, but also initiates the movement of measuring. That was the moment when people's science and for the people started. We had decided to judge everything by ourselves. It was suddenly a spontaneous act and taught by no one. We ourselves invented. The central and the local government gradually and hesitantly admitted the act of the people, but it is far from sufficient. They never stopped denying the judgment of the people for and by themselves. In Fukushima, people are forced to live under the incredible high level of radiation. The parents, especially the mothers, who are desperate sense of impending crisis to their children, marched to the Department of Education and Science in May. Surrounded by 2,000 some supporters, they negotiated with the officials of the department using specific terms with specific numbers. This is a kind of science war, a battle for new hygiene in the post-nuclear disaster society. We have a condition, we have a confidence that we could fight this war until the end. There are two kinds of exposure of radiation. One is the external exposure. Radiation comes from the outside and goes through our body or cell. It destroys DNA inside the cell. But it takes place only once, just like an X-ray. The other is the internal exposure. When we breathe contaminated air, eat contaminated food, or drink contaminated water, we take radioactive materials into our body, which are accumulated in our internal organ. The radioactive materials stay in our body and emit radiation for a long time. They gradually destroy cells and cancerize them. In the end, this causes cancer or malfunction of our body. Now, what we fear the most is this internal exposure. Japan is a nation that has been hit by nuclear bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki by America. Why on earth there are as many as 54 reactors now in Japan? This question is often asked even by ourselves. To answer this, we must look back the Cold War history. Besides Eisenhower's declaration of atoms for peace in 1953, America intended to make Japan a wedge in Asia. For that purpose, Japan should be an affluent country. That is why nuclear energy was introduced into Japan. Japan willingly accepted it. So nuclear is the symbol of Japan-US alliance. At the same time, we are convinced that it is also a symbol of occupation that still remains, especially in Okinawa, as embodied by the presence of big US military base. Hundreds of thousands of people died by the atomic bomb within a few seconds. But there is one thing that we Japanese refuse to realize. It is they who are still suffering from atomic bomb-related illness. Most of them are suffering internal exposure. They were not directly exposed to atomic bomb. Ironically, we are convinced that this will happen due to the current nuclear accident. In fact, those who tell us the horror of internal exposure are the doctors who have long taken care of the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. ICRP, International Commission on Radiological Protection, has long been the international authority of regulating radioactive protection. Finally, a fatal effect of the judgment is that they ignored internal exposure. Why isn't internal exposure considered by them? Why isn't the internal exposure considered by them? Peculiarity of the internal exposure is that one gets irrespective of the amount of exposure. Very small amount of radioactive materials can cause illness. This tells us that the use of nuclear, whether it is for war or for peace, must be prohibited. The international nuclear capital fears this most. ICRP is closely related to IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, which is also a nuclear keeper. These international organizations cooperate to keep nuclear and seek containment of Fukushima accident. They want to say this is a problem of Japan, and not others. People's science movement has a long perspective. Nuclear power, which has two faces, that is, it has ties with regulate our lives and politics. It controls our daily life as well as international politics. It consists of many lies and blackmailings. People's science begins to reveal this in front of our eyes. Working scientific paths, we are realizing this now. There are 54 reactors in Japan, but now only 11 are at work. Others are stopped for now. They are under periodical inspection. If there are no problems, they are supposed to resume operation. And none of them, after inspection, have so far been at work, which means that we have stopped them. People's will is letting them inactive. Public poll shows that 70% of the people are against nuclear power. They even think that the inconvenience of life due to lack of electricity is quite okay. But 30% are anxious and get panicked, worrying that if the situation goes on, all the reactors will stop operation in the near future, maybe next year. It is clear that who wants energy more and who wants nuclear. The situation begins to take a form of class struggle. The electric company seeks to economize electric power, by giving the consumers an excuse of lack of energy supply. They blackmailed us. When hot summer was approaching, they warned that many people would suffer. We have already gotten over this hot summer this year. Now we are living in the world without nuclear energy already. Shocked by the Fukushima accident, Germany and Italy have decided to abolish all the nuclear power plants. In comparison, we have not decided to abolish nuclear energy yet, but we have already begun to live a world without nuclear power. This is a fact. However, radioactive materials remain for a long time. Our most serious concern is the critical and wider contamination, which has revealed around us day by day. Yesterday, all the tea leaves were found contaminated. And today, we found some parks in Tokyo being seriously contaminated. The most grave contamination is of soil and food. What we most want now is the equipment that can detect soil and food more closely. The equipment is expensive, which we want nonetheless. Currently, the government begins to remove soil from the most contaminated area in Fukushima. They said that if it is removed, people can live in safety in that area. It is another lie. To remove soil has little effect in the area, and there is nowhere to take it to. The disaster in Japan is a double disaster. One is caused by tsunami, the other is caused by the radiation. These two are quite different. We can reconstruct and live again in the place of damage by tsunami. But in case of radiation, the only thing we can do is to escape. Northeastern area of Japan is facing a dilemma. The people there are damaged by both. If they say we must reconstruct, the fact of contamination is oppressed. And if they say we must escape, it is impossible to reconstruct. In fact, the local government chooses the former. In this area, it is quite difficult to cry for escape. Why does the local government prefer not to leave people escape? It is a difficult question. One thing is to keep away from regional collapse, and another reason is to kind of a shock doctrine. There are people who plot to earn money, taking advantage of the disaster. We see many Americans and American enterprises and personnel wandering around the area. American Japanese capital cooperate for profit making. But please remember, there is no money for the people to escape. Japanese soil is widely contaminated by the spread of radioactive from Fukushima. But we know that America is also contaminated. America is also a contaminated country due to the atomic bomb test repeated more than 1,000 times and by many nuclear facilities. America is one of the most contaminated country in the world. Therefore, here exist many movements against nuclear power plants, against nuclear weapons for a long time. We learned that a few days ago, there was a demonstration against old power plant located in Indian Point, near New York City. We know you put out the banner referring to Fukushima, and we know you have a deep sympathy for us. Here in New York, you have come out to the street with a great courage. I was moved by your own crying that all our lives, overcoming long-time cynicism. We too take to the street to walk another path. To walk another path, we have convinced that the state and capital lies. We really want to live another world without nuclear energy, without nuclear weapons, without military. I really want to join your movement. So, I hope you all join our movement. Thank you. And one more information. I convinced today that you can find this paper in the entrance. Stop spreading contaminated rubble all over Japan. Let us project. Please sign it or join it, please. Thank you.
My name is Chigaya Kinoshita, so I cannot make a joke like him, so start. So my present is to investigate the strategy of Japan's ruling class confronting the conjuncture after March 11. March 11 is the day of the earthquake. By way of referring back a political process that was initiated in the change of government in 2009. The change of Japan's government in 2009 had implications similar to these entailed in the birth of the Obama government in 2008. In the beginning, Obama government was expected to apply break to the radical neoliberal reform that has been accelerated from the second Clinton administration to Bush administrations. And there in the beginning, at least aimed at where the policy that more or less considered social fairness, such as the introduction of the national health insurance for all. But you know that as it was affected by the rollback from the conservative sector, the Obama government has gradually submitted to the financial capital and took an overall turn to the right, falling short of supporters' impassioned expectations. And the consequence of the loss of political legitimacy make a rise of the Occupy movement now. The same is the truth with the situation in Japan. Due to the full-hearted neoliberal reform under the rule of the Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, during a decade, the social gap and impoverishment are worsened. The so-called Lehman shock totally destroyed the social stability, Japan's social stability. the anger against the reforms erupted, particularly amongst the regional constituencies. Thus, such a government change realized in 2009. At least in the beginning, the Democratic Party, new ruling party, led by the Prime Minister Hatoyama, set forth the policies more or less in the consideration of the social fairness. For example, such as the guaranteed income, free education, and children's allowance, and foreigners' right to vote, etc. And in the sector of national security, it sought to transfer the Futenma US military base in Okinawa out of the prefecture or to abroad. But due to the counterattack of the conservative sector and financial shock and the United States, this policy suffered the setback one after another. And disappointed voters come to give up on the Democratic Party. Thus, in the early 2010, the Hatoyama administration collapsed, which was followed by the advent of the Kan administration, Kan Naoto. The primary task of the Kan government was from the beginning to reorient the Democratic Party to side more with the neoliberal and reinforce the submission to the US. The Kan administration set forth increase of sales tax and TPP. TPP is the Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership Agreement. It is for establishing the free trade regime in the region. The betrayal deprived the Democratic Party of major supporter voters. They are angry. Then the party was defeated in the subsequent election. Thus, it was expected at the coming nationwide local election in April 2011, that Democratic Party would suffer heavy loss, and the Kan government would end, and the Democratic Party and the Liberal Democratic Party coalition government would be born for advanced full-hearted neoliberal reform. It was in such a climate that March 11 was encountered. Nobody would deny the fact that the nuclear accident was a man-made disaster, but so too was earthquake and tsunami. Due to the neoliberal structural reforms having been instigated during the past decade or so, the northwestern area, Tohoku district, had already been socio-economically suffering. For example, the closure and integration of the hospital, cut down of the public service, and cut down the public service personnel, etc. In consequence, job opportunity was lost in the surrounding countryside. Many youth had to move out of the city, out to the city, and the power to sustain a community was declining. When the disaster struck the area, this circumstance delayed human and material support for the victims. And Kan government steering its policy toward cutting off the striking area and the social weaks, citing the opportunity of the critical juncture. It was financial establishment that pioneered this policy oriented. In April, Japan Association of Corporate Executives, Keizai Doyukai, made an emergency appeal consisting of the following terms. Number one, a large-scale financial investment for the recovery must be instigated following the line of financial balance. Two, by founding the Department of the Tohoku Area Reconstruction, we must plan an independence. It means a cut-off of the district based on the market mechanism. Three, increase of the sales tax and the decrease of the corporate tax. And four, promotion of the TPP. TPP is a free trade agreement. The five, maintenance of the nuclear power. the reconstruction vision team of the Democratic Party following this term almost completely, and further moved to the corporatization of the agriculture and fishery. The production sector with which the strike area were known for having been prospered. In terms of fishery, almost all fishing boats were destroyed by tsunami. And on top of that, the radioactive leak have been unequally damaging marine product. Now the democratic government is about to adopt the demolish policy that was deliver the fatal blow to the area by introducing a market mechanism. Also, the introduction of the TPP would annihilate the agriculture of the Fukushima, having been already suffering from radiation. And this process, United States has been deeply engagement. Miyagi prefecture. Miyagi is a neighbor of the Fukushima, a neighbor prefecture of the Fukushima. And Miyagi Governor Murai, he is a very hard neoliberalist. And he was executed the reconstruction limit in a broad, devastated area by tsunami. Because he thinks this is a good chance to make a large-scale development this area for big company and capitalists. And Murai's brain trust is a Boeing COE named Jim McNary. He's the brain of the Murai. And the CSIS is a Center for Strategic and International Studies. They support this process. That this is a good opportunity that the United States is trying to enter the Japanese development project. The post-March 11, Japan was created an employed population exceeding the time of the Lehman shock. The democratic government has devised no measure for this and let it alone. In today's Japan, while concern of the public opinion were focused on the nuclear issue, while fulfillment of the welfare, social security, and the medical care and employment policy are awaited more than ever. Nevertheless, the Democratic Party and the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, and the financial establishment and the United States are seeking to plant a new seed for the capitalist accumulations, taking this crisis as a good opportunity. I think it would not be pointless to call this a shock doctrine of the Japanese types. In September, the Khan administration is down, and the new government was born. It is a Noda government. But the Noda government is very afraid of the anti-nuke public opinion. So he knows when to keep silence. But when he went to the United States and meeting with Obama in September, Noda, he promised to Obama for promote nuclear power. Noda was continued to be a conservative policy so far. However, Japanese public opinion and the social movement changed dramatically in the past 6 months. In recent decade, there is nothing movement right now. Continuous demonstration and some of the movement it's changed our common sense on movement gradually. So, but okay, 終わり。
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Great. Well, first, I want to thank, again, especially Sabu and Yuko and everyone involved in organizing today. And it's a real honor and a joy for me to be on this panel. I'm going to be speaking about abolitionist solidarity after March 11th in Japan. And I want to begin by showing you a piece of stencil art that Keisuke Narita, who I think is downstairs smoking right now, made. He runs the anarchist info shop, Regular Rhythm Asylum in Tokyo. And as you can see, the stencil says, "End nuke power and end Civ." End Civ is a film by Franklin Lopez, who's based in Vancouver. The Japanese subtitles were translated by Daigo Shima, who's here in the audience. And the director just toured Japan. I know, yeah, let's applaud Daigo, because he did a really great job making this film. Daigo, you can stand up so everyone knows who I'm talking about. He's right there, yeah. Thanks to Daigo's Japanese subtitles, yay! The film has just toured Japan with the director. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the film, you can watch it online for free. If you Google end:civ, it'll come up, and you can watch it in a number of languages, including Japanese. And the other inspirations, along with this poster and the tour in Japan, the other inspirations are the abolitionism underwriting the prisoner hunger strikes in California right now, as well as some of the abolitionist discourse that is, for example, underwriting the decolonized movement in Montreal, which is where I currently live. So let me see if I can keep this here so you can look at it while I talk. So that's what I'm going to be speaking about today. And my name is Adrienne Hurley, and I teach Japanese literature at McGill University in Montreal. So let me get this. Although the specific words and vocabularies we use might differ, there are a lot of people who, out of necessity and out of an urgent awareness that our survival and the survival of the planet are at stake, are turning to what I'll be calling abolitionist movements and abolitionist cultures. I come to this vocabulary myself through prison abolitionist movements, and though I will try to explain what I mean along the way, if anything's unclear, please let me know. First, I want to offer a very basic description of abolitionist politics. Simply, it's about abolishing that which harms us: slavery, the prison system, nuclear power plants, etc. The grand liberation movements of modernity are certainly unfinished, and many contemporary abolitionist cultures I know or have learned about see themselves as carrying on an ongoing resistance. And as many others have suggested, abolishing the prison system today is about completing the work of the emancipation of slaves. For example, Ruthie Gilmore, who teaches here, has written about this subject. The abolition of capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, white supremacy, and nuclear power plants are also unfinished business in our liberation from what Sabu Kozo calls the apparatus, or our liberation from whatever we might call it. Derek Jensen and Franklin Lopez call it civilization. So in a very basic sense, I'm talking today about a politics, culture, and theory designed to destroy, eliminate, and abolish that which structures and guarantees things like genocide, planeticide, and so much harm. And I'm going to trace a very brief history of some of the abolitionist solidarity movements over the past 6 months since March 11th. Because these solidarities seem to be proliferating, the abolition of authoritarianism, capitalism, and all their nasty progeny seem increasingly likely, in addition to being necessary. I should ask, since I know Keith is filming this, one of the passages I'm going to quote has a cuss word in it. Is that okay? Okay, I am going to cuss in a minute. Last March, I was in Southern California, along with at least 3 other people in this room, attending a conference with thousands of abolitionists, anti-white supremacists, and anti-authoritarian queers, and it was entitled Critical Ethnic Studies and the Future of Genocide. The first day of the conference was March 10th, and one of the plenary speakers was Wazia Tawing, a professor in the Indigenous Governance program at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. Those of you who've seen the film and Civ will remember her from that film as well. Wazia Tawing began her talk by saying, "It's important for us to remember that Indigenous life has suffered so this institution could be here. Indigenous life has suffered so that we could have this conference here. Much the same could be said of this gathering here, and perhaps one of our first orders of business is the abolition of settler colonialism and white supremacist occupation of this land by the culture or the apparatus that feeds on devastation to exist. This is why, for example, some of the local movements and actions in solidarity with the Wall Street protests, such as the one we're underway in Montreal, are referring to their efforts as decolonizations. And this all suggests is also an abolitionist approach. Well, the reason why I bring this up is March 10th in Riverside, when Waziatuin was speaking, it was already March 11th in Japan. And she started speaking around 9:30 p.m. in California, so it was early afternoon in Japan, just after the earthquake. She spoke about planetary devastation and what she called the perils of professionalization in the times of collapse. She challenged us to think about what is sustainable and what is not. She showed image after image of more planetary devastation, of oil spills, clear cuts, thousands of dead birds dropping from the sky, and millions of dead sea life washing up on shores. She told us the delusions underwriting the devastation were already unraveling, that the rapacious civilization itself was already unraveling, and that it was our job to facilitate the end of that as quickly as possible to ensure not only our survival, but the survival of the planet. It was after hearing her talk that some of us who are here today learned what was happening in Japan. I am still living in the psycho-emotional state of that moment. Questions and strains of anarchist thought I had avoided in my decades as an anarchist prior to that moment, and here I'm thinking of what's often referred to as primitivism or green anarchism, were suddenly all that I could think about. On the last day of that same conference in California, after the first explosion in Fukushima, one of the plenary speakers was Audra Simpson. And Audra is a professor here in town in Columbia's anthropology department. And here's where I'm going to cuss in a minute. She talked to us about Columbus's entrails. His entrails, she argued, are where we are. She thus began, not with his voyage or his historical person, but the place where we are, which she suggested is in him. And she went on to say, quote, "We have been ingested by the motherfucker, all of us, and we are in his innards." The goal then, of course, would be for us to claw our way out, right? This was, I think, a call for us to consider abolitionism, in this case, the abolition of where we are, from the inside out. Those of us inside the belly of the beast are called on to act as abolitionist escape artists whose liberation will necessarily involve the destruction of the apparatus, the destruction of the body that long ago ingested us, that we were born into. My interest in talking about this kind of thought today wasn't just because of what I was hearing in March or where I was. It was obviously inspired by the NCIV tour and the stencil that Keisuke Narita made and what's been going on in Montreal, but it's also inspired by my ongoing engagement with prison abolitionism related to youth in Japan and the United States. And I'm just going to give a very brief description of that. In spite of the obvious preponderance of evidence that tells us that the expansion of criminalization and sentencing policies creates expanded imprisoned populations, the general public in Japan, like its counterparts in North America, have been successfully coached to support tough-on-crime measures in the interest of so-called security. This is how, for example, you can be imprisoned, you can be arrested and held without charge for 23 days in Japan. Something that's being used against activists at denuke demos to try to stop movements. We also know that states like Japan, the United States, and Canada have always and increasingly imprisoned and institutionalized more and more of the youth who are most ill-served by those states. the criminalization of poverty and oppression, for example, is and has been as broadly instrumental for the sustainability of Japan as a state as it has been for the US or Canada. At the level of official discourse, policies touted as tough on crime are presented as a matter of public safety or security, but when we look at how our youngest populations are treated by the state, we see it is in fact designed to expand options for preemptive and indefinite detention, to forestall resistance, to forestall or prevent insurrection, a practice that quite literally identifies, sequesters, and neutralizes the populations that stand to benefit the most from an insurrection, to do so before they have the opportunity to develop a political analysis or to organize. In other words, prisons and policing are for the security of what Sabu calls the apparatus, or if we want to call it, of Columbus, or of capitalism, or the state, whatever we're calling it, or however we're seeing it, that this practice of preemptive policing is intended to promote the security of that. And not us. So whether we're talking about trans youth, indigenous youth, buraku youth, zainichi youth, poor youth, immigrant youth, homeless youth, there's no shortage of liberation struggles or forms of resistance or insurgence that might be possible that I think are surely necessary. Because this is what we're up against, abolitionist solidarity has some real strategic and tactical advantages for us. As one example, I think there's talk down here, there certainly has been in Montreal, in regarding to the occupations and decolonizations as a lack of clarity regarding plans or lack of focus regarding future plans and demands. And I think asking for clarity about what comes next poses the wrong political question. Frankly, I can't think much beyond an end to prisons or an end to nuclear power or an end to white supremacy. And there's certainly so much we get to learn upon abolition that will impact what comes next. How much more we'll be able to theorize then. This is not to argue against or even to minimize the incredible work that many are already engaged in. About how to live the way we want to live here and now, but rather to acknowledge that we probably can't yet see or know everything beyond or without the apparatus or outside of Columbus's innards. And I also can't see much further myself right now than an end to genocide and an end to planicide. So going back to where one might enter into abolition movements, I want to share one more thing about prison abolitionism that we might bring to nuclear abolitionisms and other abolitionisms. And this is an example from the preemptive policing practices that I mentioned earlier. In the United States, I think most folks are familiar with gang enhancement sentencing clauses that are tacked on to the end of sentences given to kids who are, deemed gang members, which could simply be because of race or because of where you live. There's something similar that happens in Japanese law that I want to kind of explain now, and it's called guhansai or pre-delinquency profiling, which enables the family court to intervene with youth who know or associate with already criminalized people or who exhibit signs of pre-delinquency. Now, this could be anything from running away from home to your family or your community history. Family court in Japan, like its counterparts in North America, preemptively establishes contact with potential delinquents through profiling. As the law is expanded to allow in more and more youth of younger and younger ages, and the time limits on sentencing, which had been up to a maximum of 3 years until the dawn of 21st century, have also been scrapped altogether, and more room has been made to subject youth to adult criminal processes. We're seeing that the potential for increased mass detention of potential rebels is skyrocketing right now in Japan. When you combine this with the fact that like any activist can be pulled out of a demonstration and held in jail for 23 days without charge, during which time you could lose your job, during which time the police are probably interrogating your family members and your friends and your coworkers, you see that the really aggressive push to like neutralize any kind of resistance is, muscular and getting more so, to say the least. By assessing the threat posed by imprisoned youth in terms of the challenge they might someday pose to a state or the apparatus if they weren't quite literally incapacitated behind bars, we can begin to think about this as something other than like kind of a crime and punishment story or something about like morality or offense, and situate these discussions where I argue they belong in the context of social movements and struggles for autonomy and self-determination. Precisely the kind of politics underwriting what I think Keisuke Narita's stencil art there says. Like, so if kids are being locked up, whether they're native kids or Zainichi kids or trans kids or immigrant kids, instead of making sure they're less likely to be able to resist and threaten the state, I think our challenge is to make sure they are more likely to be able to do so. And so that's how I kind of came to thinking about these things. I've really appreciated the way that much of the denuke movement, including some people who I think are probably smoking downstairs, such as the Rescue Committee that was formed after the targeted arrests of activists at an anti-nuclear demonstration on May 7th in Tokyo. They foregrounded an abolitionist and anti-police stance as part of their support for their imprisoned comrades. They made it clear they would not recognize the criminal justice system's authority. They wanted their comrades out, and they weren't going to shut down any critique of the policing system in the process. To me, this was the most exciting and radicalizing moment I learned about in the post-March 11th months from afar. And of course, we need our attorneys and we need engagement with these systems to survive and to get out, but it doesn't mean our movements need to surrender our critiques of the systems. So I want to thank everyone here who's been a part in forging those ties, and that's what I wanted to share today. So thank you very much. Oh yeah, you want to hold it up? Yeah. I want to see. It's nice, right?
Hello, my name is Ayumi Goto. Thank you for coming to this symposium, and thanks for Todd Thomas Sapon for inviting us to New York. And I'd like to talk about everyday life with radiation. After March 11th, we have to make decisions at every phase in everyday life. What should we eat? What should we drink? This happens not only when we eat or drink, but also when we go out and talk with friends. For instance, one of my friends who live in Tokyo always checks the amount of radiation before he goes out. In my case, when I face disease, which people close to me have made for me, I always feel embarrassed about asking them where the ingredients came from and whether they are safe to eat. Recognition of radioactive contamination differs from person to person, and that difference has an enormous influence on our everyday life. We can say that It was the direct damage of the disaster that affected everyday life after March 11th. Relationships were ruptured and people were torn apart from each other. Sato Sachiko, who came here in New York, said, "It is sad that the victims' It is said that the victims' families and local people are unable to share their feelings and memories together. These have a direct impact on stress and mental health." According to her, people are divided by their own decisions regarding what to eat or not to eat, to escape or not to escape, what to believe or not to believe. There are deep fissures that separate people who are angry at the government, mass media, financiers, and academics. Anger coming from those who went to live their daily life as before. The people who have suffered the most are those who bear the labor of reproduction, nurture and food producers, such as farmers and fishers. In everyday life, the real threat is the possibility of being contaminated by radiation. The people who live in Fukushima and other highly contaminated areas are threatened by both internal and external exposure. However, policies underway in Fukushima are decontamination without evacuation and research without treatment. Although the emergency evacuation preparation zone, that is the area located within 20 to 30 kilometers from Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. The area where the annual rate of radiation exposure is less than 20 millisievert has been dissolved on September 30th. There is no clear idea about how to do the work of decontamination. The internal exposure have already become obvious. For instance, 130 children evacuated from Fukushima to Nagano Prefecture, which is 250 kilometers away from Fukushima. They are examined medically, and among 10 of the children, something wrong was found with their thyroid gland. Thyroid gland, I'm sorry. From now on, probably such damage will become visible and spread gradually. The issue of utmost urgency is to evacuate people from Fukushima to safer areas immediately. Also, contaminated foods and labels are circulating and being accepted in various regions, making radiation exposures an increasingly intimate problems for people living in any part of Japan. The point I want to make here is the historical context of research without treatment. Today, local governments have distributed external radiation dosimeter called a glass bed for children in Fukushima to wear, and the children are also told to keep diary journals. Some local governments have distributed glass bags to pregnant women, It was the National Cancer Center that proposed to the Japanese government and the Fukushima prefecture the distribution of these grass beds. The grass beds are collected every 3 months, and the data of radiation level are compiled by professional companies or research institute and reported to the National Cancer Center. But the center and the government have never told those who wear the grass badge how to avoid radiation exposure and how to deal with damage to their health. In their intention is to truly help people. If their intention is to truly help people, the best way is to evacuate them from the contaminated area to the safer area where children don't need to wear grass beds. Some parents skeptical that this research only intends to collect the data of external radiation exposure for younger age group and were worried that if it shows dangerous level of radiation, the companies and the government will hide this fact. This research without treatment situation reminds us what was done in Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the US occupation after World War II. In August 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on these two cities. A lot of people were exposed to heat and radiation, and most of them were killed. A year later, ABCC, which stands for the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, was formed under the prodding of the US Army and instituted by President Truman's order. ABCC constructed a facility in Hiroshima City and started to research the effects of radiation on people. Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, noted that the bombings to Hiroshima and Nagasaki offered a normalistic opportunity for measuring radiation effects on human population. The bodies and data of atomic survivors, Hibakusha, were collected, but the staff of the ABCC never offered any treatment. The main investigation was on the genetic impact on radiation. And needless to say, the Japanese government was an accomplice. Of course, it was not only the Japanese people under the US occupation who were forced to be guinea pigs for nuclear experiment. Today, those who live in Fukushima are forced to be new guinea pigs for the nuclear industry. Ruiko Muto, a woman from Fukushima, has stated, "People of Fukushima have become the subject of a nuclear experiment. Vast amount of radioactive waste will remain." In spite of the huge sacrifice, the crowd of the proponents of nuclear power prevails. We are all girls of the Northeast quietly burning the fire of Earth. Nuclear power has created fissures within people's everyday life. When nuclear plants were built one after another in Japan, a lot of communities whose lands were targeted for the construction of nuclear plants were divided. Same division must have occurred in various places around the world. Against such policies, 14 children in Fukushima have already brought legal action to demand the right to receive their education in safer places, where annual radiation exposures are not over 1 millisievert. In addition to an ordinary people's movement to measure radiation level, a movement to avoid contaminated foods and labels have occurred in various places. What is noticeable in this movement is the role of women, especially women who raise children. Most of them are neither activists nor feminists, but they have raised their own consciousness after March 11th, in the face of danger in everyday life. And they use their communication tools, such as distributing information through word of mouth and social networking service, to reach out to local government and appeal to those who ignore this situation. Women in Japan are planning an action named It's About Time We Break the Silence. Women across the nation will take a stand and sit in protest. This one. And this action will start on the 27th of this month. Women from Fukushima will first have a sit-in front of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry in Tokyo, and afterwards, women from all over Japan will join the sit-in, and in some local areas, women will do sit-in where they live. These movements, these movements are reinventing relationships between people and creating limitless forms of communality in our society. Thank you. Additionally, I'd like to express the movement of Occupy Wall Street. Some of my friends from Japan joined the occupation of Occupy Wall Street now. And this is Higuchi-san and Narita-san. And Matsumoto-san is now restroom. And so please visit their tent and talk with them about the situation after March 11th. Thank you.
I only have a few concluding remarks because I feel that much of what needed to be said has been said. I only want to say a few things. First, that Fukushima is already with us, and in more than one way. And I'm very happy for this panel, because even though the name Fukushima is now familiar to most New Yorkers, and I imagine to many Americans, nevertheless, what is really happening in Japan, in the Fukushima area, and in the country in general, I think it's largely still unknown, given the amount of occlusion, even the disinformation that has characterized the media reports. But secondly, I want to say that Fukushima is already with us because not only the currents are bringing the contamination to our shores. For example, it has already been found that in California, the mortality rate of infants has increased by 30% in the 2-3 months after the disaster. Also, there are reports that radiation from Fukushima has been found in food, in the milk, for example, of cows in Vermont, in the coastal waters of Maine. And interesting enough, much of this information that I found eventually on the net has come to me from women in Maine who have told me that this summer they would not take their children to walk along the shores because they had heard that the waters may be contaminated. But there are other ways in which Fukushima is with us. And first of all, is the fact that we are Fukushima in a way, as Sabu very powerfully put it, representing in a condensed and intense way an experience that we are now living more and more every day. You know, the experience of a society that, in a capitalist system that continuously refuses to give us any guarantee for our reproduction. But this is not something completely new, because in fact, the United States is one place where, in fact, we have had many, many Fukushimas over the years. And I want to, today, looking for material for tonight's presentation, I found among my clippings a newspaper's article from 1995 that gave the news of a settlement that the United States government made on that year to apologize and compensate some of the victims of people, hundreds and hundreds of people, victims of experiments that the United States government has conducted in the years between 1944 and 1974. For 30 years, the United States government has literally tested nuclear energy on the bodies of citizens by injecting plutonium in many groups of people, prisoners, children in a school for retarded children in Massachusetts, you know, Eskimo people, patients in hospitals. This, I think, gives the measure of the kind of society we live in. Not to mention the United States, the atomic test the United States has conducted at the expense of other countries, but also at the expense of people in the United States. I think the United States is probably the only country in the world who has bombed itself, who has bombed its territory and has bombed its populations with hundreds of underground tests and above-ground tests that have caused the death of thousands of people. Not to mention the experimentation it has conducted on its own soldiers, who were asked and forced to stay for hours, you know, after the explosion of atomic bombs, so that they could collect data and become themselves, you know, guinea pigs. So, as George very properly said, we cannot confront nuclear power without at the same time confronting the kind of society, economic system in which we live that is continuously based on human sacrifices. And I think it's very understandable and very appropriate that those who have been conducted the staunchest struggle against the many Fukushimas that are occurring today to the world, although few places, I think, are as nightmarish as the Fukushima area. But those who have conducted the strongest struggles have been women. You know, in fact, I think if we look historically and to this day, because women have been those most responsible for the reproduction of their family and the reproduction of their communities. You know, they are ones who have always refused, right, to turn the reproduction into a form of death, which is exactly the situation that Hayumi has described. where every moment you have to decide, what to give to eat to your child, knowing that what you're going to eat, to give them to eat, might probably kill them in the long term, or decide whether you're going to allow them to play outside the home, or you're going to lock them in the house, where every moment of reproduction becomes a confrontation with death. Now, I will want just to conclude now, because, as I said, many things have been very, very eloquently presented already. But I want to say in conclusion that we have to learn, from the mothers of Japan. We have to learn from the struggle that they are making, and learn that we certainly cannot continue business as usual. For example, we cannot continue to put on our program list or list of objectives that we want jobs, that we want employment, without specifying what kind of jobs. Today, most of the jobs, or many of the jobs that are proposed to us or made available to us are nuclear jobs in one form or another, cleaning the various disasters that capitalism is producing. So we also need to learn that we have to take our life in our own hands and our reproduction in our own hands, because the reproduction that this society offers to us, it's really a reproduction that it's in fact a form of destruction. Thank you.